Hello there, this is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Fazakri, coming to you live from Algiers. According to some analysts, throughout the past few months, Vladimir Putin has offered up all manner of outlandish excuses for his invasion of Ukraine. At various different times, he has blamed the war on everything from NATO expansion to imaginary Nazis, while also making completely unsubstantiated claims about Western plots to invade Russia and Ukrainian schemes to acquire nuclear weapons. The reality, it now transpires, is considerably less elaborate and infinitely more chilling. Putin has launched the largest European conflict since World War II for the simple reason that he wants to conquer Ukraine. Putin's latest comments underline his imperial objectives in Ukraine and expand on years of similar statements lamenting the fall of the Russian Empire. For more than a decade, he has questioned the historical legitimacy of Ukrainian statehood and publicly insisted that Ukrainians are really Russians, one people. Putin has also repeatedly accused Ukraine of occupying ancestral Russian lands and has blamed the early Bolsheviks for bungling the border between the Russian and Ukrainian Soviet republics. For an in-depth analysis on the war and its global impact, I am joined live via Skype by Mark Lowe, geopolitical analyst and member of advisory board at Pyramid Temi Group from Italy, along with John Phoenix, international relations expert and founder of SHOA organization from England. Maybe he could be joining us a bit later since we're having problems reaching him with our Skype. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. A short break and we get down to discussion. Let's try to commence with what's on tap today. Russian troops control most of the city of Severodonetsk, an important enclave in Donbass, which will receive advanced missile systems from the United States. The troops already occupied half of the city, as confirmed by its mayor, but the city is still defending itself while EU Commission surprises country with a visit. Let's follow the report and we delve into discussion.
According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, Russia's troops have destroyed hundreds of military targets in continued ground and air missile attacks. As for the Ukrainian side, they claim to have pushed back the Russian troops, advancing toward Bakhmut city in eastern Ukraine. In a press briefing, Ukrainian Defense Ministry affirmed that the battle for Severodonetsk saw some Ukrainian troops lose up to 90% of their effective military response, as they have withdrawn towards Lysychansk. Meanwhile, Ukrainian president renewed his calls on Western countries for more ammunition as the latter ran out. Elsewhere in Severodonetsk, troops are still in control of Azot chemical plant amidst fierce confrontations between armies.
The situation in the Donbass region is very tough. Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Krakow are now in the epicenter of the confrontation. Taking into account the presence of a large chemical plant in Severodonetsk, the strikes of Russian army there, among other places including air bombings, is simply madness.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made a surprise visit to Kyiv, where she met the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Underlining his bid to join the EU bloc, Ukraine's leader called for new sanctions to target more Russian officials, including judges, and to hamper the activities of all banks, as well as gas giant Gazprom's, and all Russian companies helping Moscow in any way.
6 packages of EU sanctions have become a tangible instrument of pressure on Russia during the war. However, the war, unfortunately, is still going on. So the 7th package of sanctions is needed, and it must become even more powerful.
This comes ahead of the decision of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to visit the Ukrainian capital Kyiv by the end of June as part of his support to the war-torn country.
So, Mr. Mark Lowe, Russia is now in control of much of Severodonetsk, the epicenter of the battle for Ukraine's eastern Donbass region. Zelensky has said the fight for this strategic city may dictate the outcome of the war in the east of the country. What are your own analysis of the situation on the ground?
At the risk of oversimplifying, I think basically the battle for the city, which in many different ways is similar to the battle for Mariupol, will indeed determine the future of this conflict, in as much as while the Ukrainian troops are doing their very, very best to counter the Russian invasion of the city, currently Russian troops appear to hold most of the city. They are bombarding the city in an absolutely terrific fashion. This is obliging the Ukrainian troops to retreat, to reassemble, to reconsider the means via which they can repel the Russian troops. This is having a very important impact, negative impact, on their abilities to conduct what is now basically street-to-street fighting. So what we have is a situation where Ukraine is unable to reply with heavy artillery and is very much relying on the capabilities of the troops in the town to repel the Russians. This, quite simply, is not working, and I don't think that we can tell ourselves any fables. I think we have to be very, very realistic and admit that this is a situation that cannot last for very long at all. So I think it is almost inevitable that the city will fall, and this will be, from the Russians' point of view, a prestigious victory, even if talking in terms of victories is somewhat ridiculous. But the strategy at the moment is to continue bombarding the city, destroying the city, and making it absolutely impossible for the Ukrainian troops, who are, apart from anything else, running very, very low on munition and having enormous difficulty in having to regroup and redesign strategies. So I hate to say this, but I am very, very skeptical in regards to the Ukraine managing to hold the city.
Mm-hmm. But Mr. Maclot, it seems that Ukraine is indeed losing against Russia on the front lines and is now almost solely reliant on the weapons from the West to keep Russia at bay. So why are they stalling to send them the weapons, Mr. Maclot?
Well, I think there are two principal reasons. The first reason is that amongst the European nations, so European Union nations, and also the United Kingdom, there is no clear policy at all. I think at this point we've reached a situation where the policy is to wait and to see how the situation develops in the Ukraine. Now, what does this mean? This means that on the one hand, you have been supplying arms, and I think this is a perfectly legitimate and an absolutely necessary form of support to a nation that has been invaded by another country. However, nobody has actually managed to come up with any form of plan in regards to what they would like to see. I say this because if I'm involved in supplying arms, if I'm involved in supporting another country, I also need to have a very clear idea as to what I want to see as a result of my support. Mm-hmm. Currently, we do not see any clear picture, any clear idea at all as to what Europe and the United Kingdom and indeed the United States of America actually want to see as a final outcome. This is obviously creating a number of problems internally. Let me make the example of Italy. Italy has supported Ukraine through supplying arms and equipment of diverse types. Initially, there was the support of the Italian electorate. Now, there's a situation where there's a lot of discussion in Italy and also amongst the political parties that are part of the coalition government in regards to should this continue, should this not continue. The same also applies to Germany. So there is less of a rush. There is a little bit of reticence, a little bit of hesitation in continuing to supply arms. The second consideration is the following. While we're supplying arms, we're also arming a country whose future is very, very uncertain. So there is also the issue of what happens next. Will, for example, arms that have been supplied to Ukraine become part of an illegal market of arms and munition? Mm-hmm. So will organized crime take advantage of this in the future? So there are a number of reasons why the urgency and the need to require to supply arms and munitions have slowed down a little bit. There are also logistical issues, but I think the logistical issues are the very least of the problem. I think right just now, we have a number of question marks in regards to how efficient and how effective is our strategy of arming the Ukraine.
Let me include here in the discussion Mr. Greg Simons, a political analyst. Thank you for joining us. Since Phoenix could not make it, John Phoenix could not make it, Mr. Greg Simon, my question relates to the issue of armament and ammunition. We see that Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and the West is still stalling sending effective armaments and ammunition to Ukraine. And even Joe Biden himself expressed concern of perhaps sending a long-range missile system to Ukraine, and he was afraid of Russia using these armed missile technology in boosting its own armament. What can you say about that?
Well, the point is, I mean, people are talking hypothetically about weapons which are given by the West getting into the wrong hands in Ukraine. Well, I can tell you they are already in the wrong hands. And I've heard from reliable sources, for example, that the Romanian border with Ukraine, where you have different smuggling rings, are now well outgunned precisely because Western weapons have been supplied. And Ukraine is a country which has a history of corruption. So, I mean, it's not a surprise. If we go back to after Euromaidan, when you had more covert supplying of weapons to Ukraine, Ukrainian government sold them partly to Assad, which the US was trying to regime change. So you can see these things are likely to repeat again. And I mean, if we look at some of these Ukrainian units that are refusing to fight, the main point why they're refusing to fight is because they say they're not getting enough weapons and equipment from their own government and military structure. So, I mean, it's a huge risk doing this, not to mention the fact that these weapons may, in fact, be captured. And if they're captured, then this technology can be examined. And that is also an additional risk. So we're talking about multiple risks. And also, as your previous speaker said, I mean, where's the return on investment? Because this idea and this narrative Ukraine is winning is obviously not the case now. I mean, it's clearly demonstrated they are on the defensive. And, I mean, Zelensky's made the point that the Ukrainian military will fight to the last man. I mean, this is not a measure of strength, but a measure of desperation.
And what can you tell us about the visit of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who traveled to Kiev on Saturday to discuss Ukraine's bid to join the EU with President Volodymyr Zelensky? She indicated that the Commission should be able to complete its assessment of whether the country should be granted candidate status to join the EU within the coming week. How difficult is it for Ukraine to join the EU? And how is this membership going to affect the Russian advancement in Ukraine? And don't you think that by having Ukraine join the EU bloc, the EU is going to pay heavy economic price rebuilding this country? That's in case the war let up, of course.
Well, I mean, there are so many things wrong with it, as you rightly point out. I mean, where are the Copenhagen criteria, which the EU stresses as being necessary to even begin the process of being considered to join the EU? I mean, this is not an objective process. This is a subjective geopolitical process. And I think it's a lot of it to do with political virtue signaling and holding out that carrot so that Ukraine goes on that little bit longer to fight for something that it's unlikely to get. I mean, if a country like Turkey, which is much more functional, cannot get in for decades, why would a country like Ukraine that is at war, which is divided, which has all of these internal and external problems, why would that be given priority.
Yes, very nice. What about you, Mr. Mark Liu? What are you, or what are your comments on what Greg Simons just stated about Ukraine's membership, and what can we expect from Ukraine's integration in the EU?
Well, first and foremost, I agree 100% with Greg's observations. I would add another comment that quite recently, Vladimir Putin compared an eventual Ukrainian membership of the European Union as being akin to Ukrainian membership of NATO. So even here, we have yet another problem. But that aside, I think it's very, very difficult for the Ukraine to join the European Union for a whole series of considerations that range from a whole number of reforms that are necessary, legislative reforms, fiscal reforms. We have the huge issue of corruption. We have a huge number of issues that currently would categorically block Ukraine from any chance, from any possibility of even beginning the membership process. Secondly, I'm perplexed. I don't understand why there is this incredible rush to open European arms to Ukraine. This is a country that, as Greg quite correctly pointed out, has been invaded. This is a country that's in a war. This is a country that has other more pressing issues to deal with today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Exactly. Talking in terms of accession talks to the European Union is, I think, absolutely precocious and somewhat ridiculous. Exactly. And also places a lot of stress on European relationships with other European countries that are either being denied or their requests are being delayed, or even in some cases talks in regards to beginning the process are being delayed. So there is a certain amount of unfairness about this.
Yes, indeed. Moving on to a different note now, the Russian-backed authorities in southern Ukraine say they have started handing out Russian passports to locals in two cities, Kherson and Melitopol. The Russian TASS agency said 23 Kherson residents received a Russian passport at a ceremony through a simplified procedure. The agency also stated that thousands in the neighboring Zaporizhia region, which covers Melitopol, applied for the Russian citizenship. So here, Mr. Greg Simon, the passport is the most important document a person can possess in life, and the Russian army has conquered most of the Kherson region at the start of its military operation. Does this mean Russia considers the region as part of the territory now? What does this move connote and symbolize?
Well, I mean, it opens up a lot of questions, whether these passports are for people that are going to stay, or whether these passports allow for those people to move into Russia, the territory which officially is part of the internationally recognized as being part of the Russian Federation. Of course, Ukraine does face the problem, and this has been mentioned by different academics and observers. I mean, Ivan Kachanovsky is one of such observer that notes, I mean, the longer Ukraine holds out in this, what is essentially a losing battle, the greater the price is going to be. And this might include territorially speaking, because as you mentioned, these territories have been conquered, and now the Ukrainian military is admitting to losing a minimum of 200 or 300 soldiers a day. So the problem for Ukraine is not whether enough weapons can be supplied, because there are a lot of weapons. The problem is, will they have enough soldiers to continue the fight? This is the actual question. And of course, this impacts upon this escalating cost of continuing the war.
Mr. Mark Liu, Ukraine denounced this move as a flagrant violation of its territorial integrity, saying Putin's decree was legally void. What's your say in this?
First and foremost, there's also an issue of public relations, if you like. It's a bit of a media exercise. It's something of an attempt to reinforced the concept of this territory now being, if not part of the Russian Federation, so extremely aligned with the Russian Federation that Moscow feels that it has the right to start issuing passports to the citizens of this region. Now, what we're looking at is very, very much a statement. So I'm not too concerned in practical terms. What makes me most interested is the fact that here we have Moscow making a very, very precise statement. It's almost as if Moscow is saying, it's over, the game is over. This is now a de facto part of the federation, albeit through the fact that Russia has conquered that part of the Ukraine, or through the concept of this part of the eastern Ukraine being so incredibly aligned with the Russian Federation that we can more or less say that it is the same thing. So I think more than anything else, right just now, it's an exercise in displaying power. It's an exercise in shaping perception. So those basically are my thoughts. I wouldn't be too overly concerned in regards to the practical considerations in this precise moment in time. It's an issue of perception and the issue of Moscow wanting the rest of the world, basically, but starting first and foremost with the citizens of that part of Ukraine, wishing them to perceive that they're now part of Russia.
Very clear. Thank you so much. According to Ukrainian authorities, Russian shelling destroyed the warehouses in the Black Sea port city over the weekend. The governor of the Mykolaiv region said that Russia was attacking food and agricultural targets in order to scare the world into agreeing on a deal to reopen the Black Sea on Moscow's terms. Satellite images released by Planet Labs PBC also showed the destruction of a grain storage facility in April in the Luhansk city of Rubzhin.
They want to do this because they're trying to trade.
They want to do this because they are trying to trade about opening the Black Sea for trade. That's why they shoot more. They shoot the agricultural enterprises, even fields just for their own movie. That field's on fire. When they shoot agricultural enterprises and grain facilities and storages, they are trying to make the situation look like there is a catastrophe in agriculture and food sector of the economy of the whole world. That's why they're rolling in the news, which is bad. This is a catastrophe, etc. Why? Because they are saying, okay, we can let you go with the trade, but give us something instead.
Give us something instead.
Back to you, Mr. Greg Simons. Up to 300,000 tons of grain may have been stored in warehouses that Kiev says were destroyed by Russian shelling last weekend. How do you foresee the food crisis impact globally?
Well, first of all, one needs to assume that, in fact, there were grain being stored in there at the time, because, satellite images do not show the contents of that. And given that there have been similar comments made before, or assertions made by Ukraine, such as the targeting of shopping malls and so forth, this has often been precipitated by the fact that military objects have been moved into that area. So it's what you would call in the local terms maskirovka. That is using these seemingly civilian infrastructure to hide something. That's one possibility. The other possibility, if it is grain, then it may in fact be either inadvertent or deliberate. If it is deliberate, it is part of this, if you like, a rather coercive negotiation process.
And the deliberate act can be from both sides, right? From Russia and Ukraine.
Definitely, and absolutely. And so, the point of the grain is, the whole world's being told about this potential famine. And this has got different prices of all kinds of not only foodstuffs, but other things escalating. So this is going to have additional effects, because a lot of these are drawn by perception rather than reality. If people perceive that there is going to be a worsened food shortage and worsened fuel shortage, then you might relive what happened in the 70s with the fuel crisis, this rapidly escalating issue. And I mean, this is all part of the geopolitics of the conflict. And the geopolitics of this conflict do not concern only Ukraine. And this is clear.
Very nice.
I mean, if you listen to what top US officials are saying, they're saying that this to weaken Russia, to use Ukraine to bleed Russian forces. I mean, this idea of recreating this Afghanistan scenario from the 1970s and 80s. So, I mean, there are a lot of interacting and intertangled grey parts to this conflict.
What about you, Mr. Mark Liu? In such case scenario, what can Western countries and the world superpowers do to lessen the effect of the crisis on impoverished countries that have been witnessing a food crisis prior to this conflict?
Okay, there is another element that has to be added to the equation. Let's not forget about the impact of climate change. For example, the grain harvest in India this year was a complete failure. India has produced around 47% of the grain that it should have produced. And this is the direct impact of a lack of rainfall and very, very high temperatures. So we're looking at a scenario which is a big jigsaw puzzle with lots of different pieces that interlock. As Greg correctly pointed out, the geopolitical angle is incredibly complex and important because the crisis in Ukraine is creating a domino effect that sees, for example, a change in relationship between Algeria and Italy, for example. Italy realizing that it had not taken into consideration the fact that it was over-dependent on Russian gas supplies, has sent a number of envoys to Algiers asking Algeria to produce and to export more gas to Italy. And this will bring about a series of changes to the relationship between these two different countries. That's just to make one first example. What can Western nations do to relieve food famine? Well, quite frankly, I think very, very little, because if we want to be very objective, we have to take into consideration some declarations made by executives from the United Nations World Food Programme and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, who in recent weeks have quite literally admitted to having completely failed in addressing the issue of famines and potential famines in a great number of countries throughout the world. So the bottom line is we've already failed a great many nations that are going to be in even more difficulty tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next year, and in 5 years down the road, due to the consequences of greater scarcity of food, higher food prices. This, in some extreme cases, can bring about social instability, which brings about political instability, regional instability. The domino effect, the potential domino effect is very interesting and very, very alarming. But to answer your question, I'm absolutely skeptical in regards as what Western nations can do to avoid famine scenarios in a great number of countries, and what Western nations can do to avoid the impact of rising food prices and scarcity of food. And I'm referring specifically to social unrest and the consequential political instability and regional instability.
Very nice indeed. And as a final question before we wrap it up, Mr. Greg Simons, I would like to shed light on the Kremlin's ongoing strategy, which is undeniably merciless and risky, but it's not necessarily irrational. I mean, analysts say. In fact, it arguably serves multiple purposes, like punishing Ukraine for having chosen a pro-Western path, a historical, or let's say, historical aberration that Russia deems unforgivable, sending a strong double message to other post-Soviet states. It is unwise to mess with Russia and expect to go unpunished, that is. And this is what Western security guarantees are worth. roll back in the expansion and presence of NATO, either formal or informal, in countries that have traditionally belonged to Russia's sphere of influence, and making sure that Ukraine cannot pose a meaningful threat to Russian national security for decades to come, especially as Russia experiences a severe demographic downturn. How do you see this?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and you've pinged most of the points. I think one of the greatest problems with the US unipolar Western-centric world order is that they have been rather arrogant and assuming. They have made or created this geopolitical problem because you've had this attempts. I mean, if we look in 2019, Rand produced a report which was how to contain Russia. Ukraine was one of those countries. Now you have this situation, and now you're going to have a large part of the world paying the price for these geopolitical ventures. And the West is assuming that their problem is everyone else's problem, when it is clearly not, because you've had countries, China, India, even Brazil, and these other countries who are not taking this Western-centric course. And I mean, you're absolutely right. It fulfills all these other different points. And what's more, this fits in to these larger global geopolitical strategies where there is increasingly a more strong belief that the global order is changing from this Western-centric US unipolar world towards a more non-Western-centric multipolar world.
Very nice.
And that this particular conflict will accelerate that. And you can see, while the West and media focuses on Ukraine, at the same time, they've been trying to, Western media and politics has been trying to project exactly the same scenario for Taiwan and China.
Mr. Greg Simons, thank you so much. We have run out of time. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.